In this film, I'm going to talk about the modern debate over the design argument and look in a little bit more detail at some of the developments the argument's undergone. Now, there's a huge amount of literature about the design argument and many different versions, and I suppose each scholar offers his or her own slightly different version of it. So this is only going to scratch the surface of the current debate, but hopefully I can give you some impression of the different possibilities and some of the key battlegrounds in the design argument. Now, where we left off with the basic introductory film was with the high point of the design argument from William Paley, who compared the world to a pocket watch. Now, with a pocket watch, it's clear that it has a watchmaker, has complex parts, they move in regular motion for the purpose of telling the time. So Paley said, we can infer that the world has a maker, an intelligent maker, God. And that seemed a very convincing argument, but, as I suggested in the other film, after Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution, in his work The Origin of Species, things took a different turn and the argument became much more controversial. That's the first thing I want to address now. So, Darwin's work in 1859 proposed the theory of evolution, in which essentially he suggested that species developed gradually. They evolved rather than being created all at once, and they did so through a process called natural selection. Essentially, Darwin suggested that if you had a particular organism, be it a bird, a bee, a human-like organism, or whatever, and it acquired a new attribute, it could be through a mutation, maybe a slightly longer wingspan or better hearing or whatever, then if that new attribute made it more likely that the organism would survive, then it would be more likely that it would reproduce, have offspring, which would in turn survive, and so that attribute would get passed down. So Darwin said, with these subtle differences, changes happen along the way, and the ones which help survival are naturally selected. They're picked out, okay, because the faster bird is harder to catch, the stronger bear is going to be a better hunter or whatever. These little variations will be passed down, and so species will change, they'll evolve, and eventually, if there's enough change, then a new species will emerge, something which is, over a long period of time, becomes markedly different from the previous one. Now, what's this got to do with the design argument? Well, simply this. What may look like the deliberate design of a feature, of an ability, of, I suppose, a mechanism, to use the analogy, could in fact be the product over many, many years of development and survival and change. And so it could be argued that Darwin's argument provides an alternative, maybe even a better explanation for the rich variety of life and the purpose in life than does the existence of an intelligent designer. Now, what did Darwin himself have to say about this? Well, he preferred not to write a whole lot about religion, and he didn't publish works on religion. And it's fair to say he was more of a pure scientist and was interested in science and wasn't really that keen to get involved in public controversies. Now, there were public controversies about his theory, and he was pillared in the media, in the press as it was, and there were public debates about it, but Darwin himself preferred to focus on the science. So he wasn't really personally involved in the public debate about creation versus evolution. But it's clear that he thought his theory did, to an extent, undermine traditional Christian beliefs. And he went on a journey from, in youth, being a very convinced Christian, away from that to at least agnosticism. Some people say atheism, but I suppose one has to read his private correspondences and journals, etc., and try to work that one out. Various books have been written on it, but Darwin himself, as I've said, preferred not to speak publicly about religion. Others have, however, and the most famous evolutionary biologist, arguing for evolution as the best alternative and the defeat of the design argument is the modern British scientist Richard Dawkins. Now, in his book, The God Delusion, Dawkins talks about this thing called Mount Improbable. Well, what does he mean by that? Well, he's trying to show that the design argument doesn't work because it is unnecessary and is poor as an explanation of life's rich variety. Here's the issue. We have complex life forms which fulfill purposes very brilliantly, and it seems wholly improbable that these things could just appear randomly. Okay, they couldn't just come out of nowhere, a bird out of nowhere with its brilliant wing, with its incredible design. That seems highly unlikely. But Dawkins says, in evolution, you are not having to say that things emerge by chance. Quite the opposite. You get to something as an endpoint which seems highly improbable, but because you get there very gradually, it's perfectly possible. In fact, he says evolution is the best explanation. So let's imagine that I wanted to get towards a highly complex being, like a human. Well, if I allow millions of years for the emergence of this life form to occur, and bit by bit our ancestors improve, and perhaps if you go through the process of human evolution, say maybe we come from some more basic primate, very similar to the ancestors of the apes of today. So we've evolved from that, and perhaps in terms of intelligence. Then you step back from that primate, or maybe it's a more simple primate-like being, a more simple mammal, a very simple mammal, and you can go back through periods of the development of life, and Dawkins says step by step, with small improvements, you can see that the human life form of great complexity and beauty doesn't just appear out of nowhere. And so it's not a bizarre and remote possibility for it to appear. We can explain it through gradual development. So if you believe Dawkins, the design argument isn't going to work because it's not necessary as a way of explaining complex life. There's a better, simpler explanation in evolution. Well, what kind of response can you bring to that? The first one I want to talk about is the attempt to incorporate evolution into the design argument. Now, after Darwin's theory was published, and there was much public controversy, some religious believers thought to reject it and defend the idea that God created all life forms pretty much as they are, but others attempted to incorporate it into a design argument and bring it into theology and into theism. One of the most famous people to do this was the anthropologist, priest, scientist Teilhard de Chardin, and he was actually very heavily involved with the discovery of human development and tracing human ancestors, working off the assumption of the theory of evolution. And de Chardin saw evolution as a creative process. Basically, he thought, can we reconcile God with evolution? Well, yes, if God is causing evolution to happen through his will, because he wants life to develop, to emerge, to improve. So in his book, The Phenomenon of Man, de Chardin argued that life was improving, was rising up towards the better, towards mind, and eventually, de Chardin was arguing, is heading to something which he called the omega point. Omega, the last letter of the Greek alphabet, which implies the idea of the end, or achieving God's end. So essentially, de Chardin's saying that humans have come an awfully long way from more primitive life forms in their evolution. God could have willed that because evolution creates things of great beauty and increasing intelligence, and humans could be part of his deliberate scheme through evolution. Now, you may or may not agree with what de Chardin's arguing, but It certainly is something which Christians have sought to do in many cases after the discovery of the theory of evolution, to try to bring their beliefs together with this and make them reconciled. The strength, I suppose, is that de Chardin's able to go with what modern scientists argue about evolution and accept the theory. But some people would say, well, he's paid too high a price in terms of his beliefs because he's fitting God around evolution and making God into this strange sort of gradual creator who sort of tinkers and improves things as he goes along. Well, I'll leave that up to you to decide. I think it's a really interesting theory. It's got some possibility in it. Maybe not completely convincing. But again, look into yourself, see what you think. Another person to work with evolution was the British theologian F.R. Tennant, working at a similar time to de Chardin. Now, in his book Philosophical Theology, Tennant attempted to argue that the process of life emerging through evolution requires a very specific type of universe, a universe which is friendly to the development of human life. Now, the universe could be set up in many different ways, but if you think about it, the conditions we have on this earth are so unique and suited to our survival that it does make you wonder, aren't we very lucky to be here? Well, Tennant suggests that we really are, and he comes up with this principle known as the anthropic principle, from the Greek anthropos, human. He's essentially saying that God has created a world with the conditions for human life to emerge in. The world could have been completely different and much more hostile to human life, but there we are, human life can emerge. The anthropic principle is saying that we can see design in the ambient conditions of the world which allow for humans to live. And humans are God's purpose. With minds, we can worship God, we can love God, and our human existence is evidence for God. Well, those are some of the first attempts to incorporate Darwin into design arguments. I want to briefly talk about some really up-to-date 20th, 21st century versions, briefly, just now. There are two British philosophical theologians, philosophers, who are famous for producing what is sometimes called the new design argument, and they are Richard Swinburne and Keith Ward. Now, what we're talking about here in the new design argument is sometimes called a fine-tuning argument, which is saying a bit like the things which Tennant started to suggest, that we should go back to the science and the conditions of the universe. Now, the universe is full of different conditions. There's X amount of radiation, or the atomic structure of elements is this rather than that. It's gravitational, constant, so on. Now, without wishing to go into science, which I am not really qualified to talk about, some of these philosophers are saying that the universe is just so, but is not like this, this, and this. I.e., the universe can be made in so many different ways, but is made in one particular way with just the conditions necessary for life to emerge, for life to evolve, and for human life to appear. I.e., the universe is finely tuned. All of the conditions are set to the just right setting on the dial so that there could be life. We can imagine so many different universes with so many different conditions which have been hostile to life and hostile to human life. But Swinburne and Ward argue our universe is such that there's an incredible confluence of conditions for our lives to occur in. And this then turns into a probability argument. Okay, our universe exists rather than some other universe. What are the chances, they ask? What is the probability of the universe emerging with just the perfect conditions for life rather than some other conditions? And if you say, well, it's really highly improbable that our universe would just occur unless some intelligent being willed it to occur, then you're producing this new type of design argument. You're saying that the world is just perfectly set for life, and it's really improbable, you think, that the world could appear with these conditions without some sort of guidance. Now, evaluating these arguments is really tricky because they're starting to move beyond the remit of philosophy or theology in proper terms. They're starting to bump up against physics and maths, and really going to the limit of what we can know through any discipline. Okay, can you know anything about what is outside of the universe, or what could have caused the universe? It's very tricky to say, because on the one hand, you might say, well, look at objects produced within our world, and if they're very complex, if they're very purposeful, it is highly improbable that they'd appear without design. But can you then infer about the whole, and then go back to the whole universe and say, look, the universe is perfect conditions, as purpose for life to occur. It's highly improbable that that would occur without an intelligent design. Well, I'm not sure you can use the same reasoning about the universe as you can about objects within the universe. Can you talk about probability outside of the universe? I think you'd have to think very deeply about what these concepts mean, like probability or universe conditions, before you can make a judgment on that. And I personally don't think I know enough, and I think the jury's still out for me. Others will make their minds up, and you should look into it. I think this is one of the most interesting, deep debates there is in the philosophy of religion. Finally, I want to briefly talk about some attempts to reject the whole Darwinian criticism of the design argument altogether. Now, this is occurring in very recent times, although I suppose traditional religious beliefs are as old as human civilization itself. But particularly in the last 15 years, I suppose, 10 to 20 years, a movement, primarily in the United States, has emerged, known as the intelligent design movement. And essentially what this is a group of scholars, just about entirely conservative Christian scholars, arguing essentially that Darwin was wrong, if not entirely wrong, was at least wrong in certain fundamental points. And a couple of the key individuals you can flag up here is a biologist, Michael Behe, and a mathematician, William Dembski. Now what they're saying is essentially the best explanation for life is not really Darwin's theory so much as it is an intelligent designer. Well, that's the design argument, pretty pure and simple if you think about it, and it's like a classic version of the argument going back to the pre-Darwin stage. But, their arguments are more sophisticated than Paley's or Aquinas' was. One of the key terms the intelligent design movement has suggested is irreducible complexity. Essentially what they're saying is there are some organisms which are so complex, have such an assortment of different parts, which all work together, that it's difficult to say how they could emerge gradually. A classic example they use is something called a bacterial flagellum, and this is a very, very small, well, it's a bacterial organism with a sort of motor mechanism in it, which has multiple parts which work together to move it along. Now, their point is that it's difficult to see how this could emerge gradually, because without one part, then the whole thing isn't going to work. So it would need to produce all of its parts together, which isn't a gradual development. So they're saying, really, Darwin's theory doesn't have as good an explanatory power for these cases as does an intelligent designer who just created such organisms with their different components. Now, there have been various attempts to respond to these objections, and I'm not a biologist myself, but I'm aware that Dawkins sees these guys as beneath his contempt. really, but he still replied to them. It said, well, of course, features and mechanisms can emerge gradually, even if complex, because they may fulfill some different function or some incremental function which is taking them along towards this. I mean, for example, think about wings. Wings can emerge gradually, even though you can't suddenly fly one day, because the wing-like features, these protrusions, may have served some purpose which was useful, which gradually developed as a purpose towards the ability to fly. I really wouldn't want you to take this from me, though. I think you should go and look at the scientific literature, see what you think. Is the intelligent design movement science? Well, they say so. Their critics say not. It's often objected that they don't really publish anything in mainstream scientific journals. They've not managed to get any serious science out that's been peer-reviewed by other significant scientists. Perhaps that's the case, but I think part of the problem is that the whole issue of neutrality flies out the window with this organisation because they're so controversial, they're so clearly linked to conservative religious and political opinions that you're never going to get a neutral appraisal of what they're doing. Personally, I don't find what they're saying very convincing. I've read Darwin's Origin of Species and looked at some of their little pieces. I don't really buy it, but I'm no professional biologist. I know many biologists, however, and they do say that they are not convinced. How are you going to find this out for yourself? Well, try and do some reading, talk to some biologists, and I guess each person will have to make his or her own mind up. My only criticism I would throw in to end this is that what they're saying, in many cases, raises more problems than it solves. On the one hand, they're providing an explanation of life, an intelligent designer, but if you look at what then is required of this intelligent designer, it's really strange. Okay, now why would an intelligent designer seemingly create multiple species which, if you believe the fossil record, die off and are replaced by slightly different ones? What on earth was the point in the dinosaurs? You intelligently create them and say, okay, I'm bored of dinosaurs now, let's do something different. It just seems that the history of life isn't accounted for very well through intelligent design to me, but I'll leave you to make your own mind up. Lastly, I want to just conclude with a few final thoughts. Well, does the design argument work now that we've looked at some of the modern debate? You need to make your mind up, and as you can see with this briefest tour, there's a lot there, and I've barely touched upon the modern debate, really. You need to find the books yourself and find out. My personal opinion is, does it work? Well, yes and no, I think. I think the argument is much stronger than some of its critics think it is, such as Richard Dawkins. I think everybody finds the world striking. It's a source of wonder, and it's a cause for personal reflection. And I don't think it's so far-fetched to see some sort of mind could be a part of that. Because you see that, opens a door to another debate about what we think mind is and what God could be and how he could exist. But I don't think it's altogether far-fetched, particularly in some of the more advanced versions, the fine-tuning versions of the argument. I think it's a point for serious reflection whether the world as we have it, with its rich life, could emerge without some sort of scheme or intelligence. Having said that, although I think that the argument isn't that weak, I certainly think it proves a lot less than some of its modern supporters think it does, particularly Swinburne and Ward. Because you can take, say, the new design argument and say this proves maybe a certain amount, that maybe, or at least probably, there is some sort of intention in the creation of the conditions of the universe. But if you're doing the philosophy of religion, and if you're a philosophical theologian, you're probably wanting to prove the existence of God. Well, is it the same thing say that you have something broadly intelligent creating conditions in the universe and say you've proved God. I really don't think it is. I don't think they can show through this line of argumentation benevolence. Okay, there's lots of goodness in the world, but you can't really quantify it's a really good world that this mind has supposedly created. All powerful. Again, I don't see how the world provides evidence for an all powerful being. Certainly, it's got to be a powerful being to create, but all powerful, can this being do absolutely everything? The world doesn't imply that. Does this being know everything? I don't really see any evidence for omniscience in the world around us. So I really don't think it works as a proof for traditional theism. Maybe for some sort of broadly theistic opinion that an intelligent being may well exist or play some part in the creation of the world. But I think as a proof of God it has its limitations too. It certainly is, though, an interesting debate, and I never get bored of reading books and articles about this, and I think I probably still won't have made my mind up on the day I die. I mean, it's taken me this long to get to an opinion of fairly entrenched agnosticism over the argument, and I can't see that shifting too soon. But maybe you'll think this argument works for you, or maybe you'll think it's a disaster. I'll leave that up to your reflection. I hope you enjoy thinking about it.